the delay. But with my usual procrastination, I'll probably forget to do my Ask Me Anything, but I should do it. Maybe I should do it soon in case I, get run over by a garbage truck or something.
Would it be like a weekly thing?
No, 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 no. I just once or twice, maybe. Or something occasional, or who knows, given whatever. Anyway, let's see now. Here we go. We are. Live stream is on. Hello, everyone. It is Weekly Marks, 30th of March. And we're looking at two chapters of Karl Marx Capital, Volume 1, chapters 16 and 17, the 2024 edition on the Autonomous Collective. theautonomouscollective.net. And this is the edition by the two Pauls. The research question I sort of got from today's yammering, or thinking about yammering, was if there is necessary labor, is there such a thing as sufficient labor? That's not answered by Marx. Well, you could say it is. But what I want to do is observe some very important problems, noting, of course, that chapter 16 is in the prior edition of Marx's translation in English. It is chapter 18 is chapter 16 in the 2024 edition is chapter 18 in the prior edition. So today we begin with different formulae for the rate of surplus value. This is Harry Cleaver's outline of Marx's analysis for chapter 16 of the current edition. So it includes Marx's formula, the surplus value to the value of labor power, that is, surplus power's ratio to necessary labor, and the comparison. Well, this is the classical political economy formula compared to Marx's version of this, right? That is surplus labor over the working day equals surplus value over the value of product equals surplus product over total product. And so, you're trying to work through what counts as S plus V in Marx's terms. And of course, it leaves out stuff. And Marx fixes that in the later volumes, right? I mean, means of production, etc. Rent, which is what I talk about over in my little corner over in Daily Coast. Today's anti-capitalist meetup. We'll have my little ramblings on that relative to carbon offset markets. But anyway, that's for another taping, I suppose. And so there's political economy formula. There it is, the understating of the rate of surplus value, the concealment of exchange for wages for labor power. It creates the illusion of sharing according to contribution versus the actual antagonism. So we've been talking about veils, and this is part of the veil construction in some ways. Value equals paid labor, surplus equals unpaid labor. It is this relationship of surplus labor to necessary labor that is it. And ultimately, the takeaway is that capital has command over labor, and it has it in a variety of ways. And as I've tried to point out elsewhere, it can happen not just from all those evil people. It can come from your friends. So you need to rethink a lot of things. So, that being said, let me point out that in today's translation reading, I've included, partially for a variety of technical reasons, the formula from the prior translation. That is the English 1867 translation that you find on the internet. So it has those terms. And one of the reasons why I do that, partially because I'm a screw up, is also because when you look at Ed George's notes for this, of course, he's working from the prior translation. So I figure that integrating the two will be better because in some ways you really still do have to go back to the prior translation, noting, of course, that in the latest translation, that is the Pauls, have decided they'd chop out all kinds of redundancy, which, yes, is confusing. Um, on the other hand, I think you need to appreciate, that some people were kind of slavish about the earlier translation, and they kept, like the equations in. Um, and of course, the two Pauls are not mathematicians or whatever, economists, so they kind of went for, whatever, a humanist solution. And uh, I may go back in and insert the Paul's version of these things, but I'm doing it today to partially be consonant with the Ed George notes, which I will read from, so that the variables are all the same. Oh, God. Okay, chapter 16, which is chapter 18 in the old version. Different formulas for the rate of surplus value. This is the Princeton edition. Readers have seen that the rate of surplus value can be expressed by the formula, and I put the formula in surplus value over variable capital. That is, it's equal to the surplus value over the value of labor power, which is also equal to the surplus labor over necessary labor. The first two formulas below represent as a ratio of value what the third one, there's a third formula, represents as a ratio of the amounts of time it takes to produce that value. These formulas, which can stand in for one another, are conceptually rigorous, period. Hence, while classical political economy worked them out in substance, we don't find them consciously developed there. We get the following derivative formulas instead. That is, surplus labor over the working day, this is equation 2, equals surplus value over value of the product, which is also equal to surplus product over total product. Now, one and the same proportion is alternately expressed as labor time, that the working day, the value in which the labor time is embodied, and the products in which this value exists. Here, of course, the product's value, the value of the product, refers only to the value produced during the workday. The constant part of the product's value is left out, means of production, et cetera, et cetera. In all of these formulas, the real degree to which labor is exploited, or the rate of surplus value, is expressed incorrectly. This is Marx's point here, and we'll see how that gets explicated by Ed George. Suppose the length of the working day is 12 hours. If we hold to the assumptions from our earlier example, the real extent of labor's exploitation will be represented by the following proportions, and this is the older translation. 6 hours of surplus labor over 6 hours of necessary labor equals a surplus value of 3 shillings. Variable capital of 3 shillings equals 100%. But if we use the formulas given in 2, we get 6 hours of surplus labor over a working day of 12 hours plus equals that expression, 6 hours of surplus labor over a working day of 12 hours equals an expression, surplus value of 3 shillings over value created of 6 shillings, which equals 50%. Now, what these derivative formulas actually express is the proportion in which the workday, or the value it produces, is divided between the capitalist and the worker. If one treats the formulas as direct expressions of capital's degree of self-valorization, the following false law will seem valid. That is, surplus labor or surplus value can never reach 100%, since surplus labor, S, Surplus labor can never take up more than a fractional part of the workday, and surplus value can never amount to more than a fractional part of the value produced during it. Surplus labor must always be smaller than the total workday. That seems logical. And the amount of surplus value produced during a workday must always be smaller than the total value produced. While in order for the ratio of the surplus value and total value produced to reach blank, they have to be equal. Furthermore, surplus labor could absorb the entire workday, that is, an average day of any week or year, only if the necessary labor were reduced to zero. And if the necessary labor disappeared, the surplus labor would as well, since it's merely a function of the necessary labor. Raising my obtuse question about sufficiency. But anyway, the ratio can never advance all the way to the limit of, let alone ascend to, blank, and yet the rate of surplus value or the actual extent of labor's exploitation does, in fact, rise that high. Take, for example, Mr. de la Verne's estimation, according to which English agricultural workers receive only a quarter of the product or its value, whereas the capitalist farmer gets three-quarters. However, the spoils of production are later divided between the capitalist and the landowner. It follows that for English agricultural workers, the ratio of surplus labor to necessary labor is 3 to 1. A rate of exploitation, and that's important, is to appreciate the idea that you can have rates of exploitation of 300%. Note, if just as a break here, as an aside, imagine the Federal Reserve calculating exploitation rates. Anyway, back to the text. Political economy's preferred method, namely to treat the workday as a constant magnitude, became an established approach, thanks to the use of the formulas given under equation 2, which always compares surplus labor to a workday of a given length, like 12 hours. The same thing happens when political economy focuses exclusively on the division of the value produced during the workday. A workday that has already been objectified in its value product is always a workday with given limits. When surplus value and labor powers value are represented as fractions of the value produced, that is, a mode of representation that arises from the capitalist mode of production itself, and one whose significance will be revealed later, the specific character of the capital relation is obscured. We don't see that variable capital is exchanged for living labor, right? This is LP, right? Exchanged for living labor. And accordingly, the worker doesn't own any part of the product that he produces. Now, what comes into view instead is the false semblance of a relation of association. This is important, where the worker and the capitalist divide the product based on the different factors that went into it. In addition, the formulas given under equation 2 can always be transformed back into the formulas given under equation 1. If we start with blank, then the necessary labor time equals a workday of 12 hours minus 6 hours of surplus labor, and we get a third formula, which I have at times anticipated here, and that is from the prior translation, surplus labor over the working day, or surplus value over value created. Now, this is problematic from, if you want to think about questions about labor, congealment, and all that other stuff, but it's an interesting question. So, therefore, in the old version, that's what it looks like. Surplus value over value of labor power, this is equation 3, equals surplus labor over necessary labor, which equals unpaid labor over paid labor. Now, this is this thing that we're going to worry about, why is the price of labor, like wages, equal to certain things, like value? But that's for another comment. After the investigations we have given above, it's no longer possible to be misled by the formula of unpaid labor over paid labor into concluding that the capitalist pays for labor and not for labor power. Now, this formula is only a popular expression, that is, unpaid labor, overpaid labor, is only a popular expression for surplus labor over necessary labor. You can see that there's semantic issues built into this. That's my little comment there. Once a person has read the explication given above, he couldn't possibly misunderstand things in the way the formula invites him to and wind up thinking that capital pays for labor rather than labor power. The formula is merely a more casual way to express it. The capitalist pays the value of labor power, or rather, he pays whatever its price happens to be. And in exchange for that, he has living labor power itself at his disposal. He consumes this labor power in two separate periods. Now, this periodicity is actually very important, as we'll see. During period one, the worker produces the value of his labor power, in other words, an equivalent. In exchange for advancing the price of labor power, the capitalist receives a product that costs the same amount. It is as though he bought the product ready-made in the market. During the period of surplus labor, in contrast, the use of labor power creates value for the capitalist, but doesn't cost him anything in replacement value. Labor power is made fluid for free. And that may come back, and I think that's an important way to express this issue. Labor power is made fluid for free. It is in this sense that surplus labor can be called unpaid labor. We can, therefore, say that capital doesn't simply act as labor's commander, as Adam Smith claimed. Its essence is to rule over unpaid labor. However, surplus value is eventually crystallized, whether it's profit, interest, rent, and so on. The materialization of unpaid labor is always its substance. This is what the secret of capital self-valorization comes down to. That is, capital has at its disposal a certain amount of other people's unpaid labor. Now, you can argue that that's the end of the chapter. You can argue that in a variety of interesting ways, rent, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, we find an example. This is footnotes to chapter 16 of the 2024 edition of Marx's Capital, Volume 1. We find an example of this in Dritter Brief on the Kirschmann von Robertus Wiedergelegung der Ricardischen Theorie von der Grundrente und Begründung einer neuen Retent Theory, Berlin of 1851. I will come back to this work, which contains a false theory of ground rent. This is that comment on Robertus and ground rent, but nevertheless penetrates into the essence of capitalist production. Footnote 2. The part of the product that merely replaces the constant capital is, of course, excluded in this calculation. A blind admirer of England, Mr. Delaverne, errs on the side of setting the ratio too low rather than too high. Footnote 3, since all advanced forms of the capitalist production process are forms of cooperation, it is naturally quite easy to abstract from their particular antagonistic character and make them out to be forms of free association, which is what Count A. de Laborde does in De l'Esprit d'association dans tous les entrées de la communauté of 1818. The Yankee, H. Carey, sometimes performs this trick with just as much success in dealing with nothing less than the relations of the slave system. Footnote 4. Although the physiocrats didn't solve the mystery of surplus value, they understood this much, quote, this is Turgot, independent and disposable wealth, which he, that is, the one who possesses surplus value, has not purchased, and which he sells. Now, this is an interesting comment, which can have other implications relative to knowledge as capital, but that's, these are my comments and not those of the Pauls or of Marx. Now, this is the note done by Ed George on the prior translations, chapter 18, different formulae for the rate of surplus value. The defect in the formula of classical political economy is the underestimation of the rate of exploitation, which occurs as a consequence of the way in which surplus value and the value of labor power are treated as fractions of the value product. To the classical political economists, the specific character of the capital relation, namely the fact that variable capital is exchanged for living labor power, and that the worker is accordingly excluded from the product, is concealed in its place. Quote, they show us the false semblance of a relation of association in which worker and capitalist divide the product in proportion to the different elements which they respectively contribute towards its formation. And you break here and say, well, how is it that managers make more money? But anyway, this is certainly about differential wages in that sense. But we need to remember the capitalist buys not labor, but labor power, right? The labor power she buys at its value, or if its price diverges from its value at its price, as if it were another commodity. But in the period for which the labor power is bought, for which the capitalist has it in his power and can put it to work, the labor both labors to the value of her labor power and then labors some more. Now, that's the synopsis that Ed George makes. This is the full PDF version of it, which is using the same math or the same things. And so, I've done all of that. I've reproduced that in the text above. So the conclusion here, of course, in other words, all surplus value, whether particular form, profit, interest, or rent, into which it may subsequently crystallize, is in substance a materialization of unpaid labor time. The secret of the self-valorization of capital resolves itself into the fact that it has at its disposal a definite quantity of the unpaid labor of other people. It's what you get for working on spec, if you want to use a more idiomatic expression. Um, I included here, of course, the table that shows us the difference between four of X number of translations. The second column is, of course, the one that's being used for the 2024 translation, and the folks' English translation is on the far right, column 4. So you can see that chapter 16 is at the end of a section of part 5 on different formula or formulae, and that part 6, wages, begins with chapter 17, which we'll get to in a second. So, in that sense, chapter 17 in the 2024 version is how labor's powers, value, and price are transformed into wages. And in the older translation, it is chapter 19, the transformation of the value and respectively the price of labor power into wages. So I think that covers most of my things for chapter 17. And if I look for whenever the clock time is, have I used up all my time? Do I have enough time? I ask the question of myself and to no one in particular. Do I have enough time to cover the rest? I think I do. And since there are no equations or math to deal with, I will read it directly. There are Ed George notes at the end, so you can see how there could be math, but not. And so I'll read chapter 17 directly so we can move on next week to chapters 18 and maybe 19. Chapter 17, Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 17, how the value and price of labor power, labor-power, are transformed into wages. Workers' wages appear on the surface of bourgeois society as labor's price, a certain amount of money that is paid for a certain amount of labor. People therefore speak of the value of labor and call it value when it is expressed as money, labor's necessary or natural price. At the same time, people speak of labor's prices in the market, i.e., the prices that rise above and fall below its necessary one. But what is a commodity's value in that context? The objective form of the social labor expended to make the commodity. How do we measure the magnitude of its value? By the amount of labor that the commodity contains. How then would the value of a 12-hour workday be determined? By the 12 hours of labor contained in a workday of 12 hours, which is of course an absurd tautology. Now, for labor to be sold in the market as a commodity, it has to exist. It has to exist before it can be sold. But if the worker could give his labor an independent existence, he would be selling a commodity and not labor. Now, setting aside these particular contradictions, we can say that if money, i.e., objectified labor, were directly exchanged for living labor, either this would negate the law of value, which begins to develop freely in the context of capitalist production, or it would put an end to capitalist production itself, which is based on nothing other than wage labor. Suppose a 12-hour workday is represented in 6 shillings of money value. Either equivalents are exchanged, in which case the worker would receive 6 shillings for his 12 hours of labor. In other words, the price of his labor would be equal to the price of his product, which means that he wouldn't produce any surplus value for the person who buys his labor. In other words, the price of his labor would be equal to the price of his product, which means that he wouldn't produce any surplus value for the person who buys his labor. The 6 shillings wouldn't be transformed into capital, and the circumstance on which the capitalist production is based would vanish. But the sale of the worker's labor, and that it is wage labor, is based on precisely this circumstance. Or the worker could receive less than 6 shillings, less than the value of 12 hours of labor for his 12 hours of labor. 12 hours of labor would be exchanged for 10 hours of labor, 6 hours, and so on. This equating of unequal magnitudes for 10 hours of labor, 6 hours, and so on. This equating of unequal magnitudes doesn't simply nullify the determination of value. We can't begin to express such a self-negating contradiction as a law. Well, we could, actually. Nor does it make sense to view the exchange of unequal amounts of labor as deriving from a difference of form. Objectified labor versus living labor. Doing so would be all the more absurd because a commodity's value is determined by the amount of living labor its production requires, rather than the amount of labor actually objectified in it. Socially necessary, etc. Let's say a commodity represents 6 hours of labor. If a new invention were to make it possible to produce the same commodity in 3 hours, the value of an already existing unit would fall by half. The existing commodity would now represent 3 hours of socially necessary labor rather than 6 hours. Hence, it is the amount of labor needed to produce a commodity, not labor in its objective form, that determines the magnitude of a commodity's value. What the money owner directly encounters in the market is the worker, not labor. What the worker sells is his labor power. The moment he begins to work, his labor ceases to belong to him and he can no longer sell it. Labor is value's substance and immanent measure, but labor itself has no value. The concept of value is not only completely effaced in the expression the value of labor, it is also flipped on its head or turned into the opposite of what it is. This is an imaginary expression just as much as, say, the value of the earth is. Yet these imaginary expressions arise from the actual relations of production. They are categories for the forms of appearance that essential relations take. Things often appear in such a way that they present themselves as the opposite of what they are. As every branch of science and scholarship knows, every branch except political economy, footnote 6. Classical political economy took the category the price of labor from everyday life without reflecting on it critically, and then asked, how is this price determined? It soon saw that with regard to the price of labor and all other commodities, changes in supply and demand explain nothing but price changes, or why market prices rise above and fall below a certain magnitude. If supply matches demand, prices won't fluctuate as long as all other conditions remain constant. But in this case, the ratio of supply and demand doesn't explain anything at all. When supply matches demand, labor's price is its natural price, which is determined independently of the ratio of supply and demand. The natural price was therefore made into the actual object of analysis, or a longer period of fluctuating market prices, for example, a year, was taken as the object. And political economists found that the fluctuations offset one another, leaving a mean average quantity or constant magnitude. Now, naturally, this magnitude couldn't be determined by its own offsetting deviations. This price, the necessary price that referred to by physiocrats, or the natural price referred to by Adam Smith, which informs and regulates accidental market prices, can only be labor's value expressed as money, as is so with all other commodities. In this way, political economists came to believe that moving through labor's accidental prices, they could press forward and arrive at its value. The costs of production were then used to further determine its value, as is done with every other commodity. Now, but what is the production cost of ... the worker? What does it cost to produce or reproduce that worker himself? Political economy unconsciously swept the question aside and held instead to the original one, because its attempt to understand the production cost of labor as such went around in circles, getting at nowhere. Thus, what political economy calls the value of labor is, in fact, the value of labor power, which exists in the worker's personality and isn't identical to its function, i.e., labor, just as much as a machine isn't identical to the work it does. Because political economy focused on the difference between labor's market prices and its so-called value, on the relation between this value and both the rate of profit and the commodity values that labor produces, it never discovered that the course of its analysis had led not only from labor's market prices to its value, but also to the point where its value is resolved back into labor power's value. Oblivious to the result its own analysis yielded, and uncritical in adopting the categories the value of labor and the natural price of labor as the ultimate and adequate way to express the value relation at issue, political economy ended up in a tangle of unresolvable confusion and contradictions, as readers will see later on. It thereby created a secure base of operations for shallow, vulgar economists who honor only appearances and do so on principle. Now, let's see how labor power's value and prices are represented in their transformed shape. In other words, as wages. We know that the daily value of labor power is calculated using a certain projection as to how long a worker will live. See actuarial tables, and that this projection assumes a workday of a certain length. Let's suppose a regular workday amounts to 12 hours. Furthermore, labor power's daily value is 3 shillings, which is the money expression for the amount of value in which 6 hours of labor are represented. If the worker receives 3 shillings, then he gets the value of his labor power, which is activated over the 12 hours. If this value, the labor power's daily value, is now expressed as labor's daily value, we wind up with a formula. That is, the value of 12 hours of labor is 3 shillings. The labor power's value thus determines the value of labor, or in money terms, its necessary price. Now, if the labor power's price were to deviate from its value, the price of labor would do the same with respect to its so-called value. So the phrase, the value of labor, is merely an irrational way of saying labor power's value, and naturally it follows from this that labor's value is always smaller than the value it produces. The capitalist always has labor power function, after all, for more time than it takes to reproduce its value. In the example given above, the value of the labor power activated over 12 hours is 3 shillings, which it can reproduce in 6 hours. But the total value produced by the labor power is 6 shillings, because, as we know, it's used for 12 hours, and the amount of value it produces depends on how long its activation lasts, not its own value. Thus, we get a result that seems preposterous at first glance. That is, labor that creates 6 shillings of value is only worth 3 shillings. We also see that this 3 shillings of value, in which the paid part of the workday, or 6 hours of labor, is represented, appears as the value or price of the whole 12-hour workday, which contains 6 hours of unpaid labor. The wage form thus erases every trace of the division of the workday into parts where necessary labor and surplus labor, paid and unpaid labor, are performed. All labor appears as paid labor. In corvée labor, this is, feudal style labor, some feudal style labor, which exists in reality. Some people even to this day, work under corvée labor terms. Paid and unpaid labor in corvée labor, time and space separate the labor that the worker does for himself and the labor he is forced to do for the estate owner. These two things are visibly different. In the slave system, all the labor performed by the slave appears as unpaid labor he does for his master, or even the labor a slave performs to replace the value of his own means of subsistence, or the labor he does for himself, in effect. But with wage labor, it's the other way around. Even surplus labor or unpaid labor appears as paid labor. There, the property relation conceals that the slave does some work for himself. Here, the money relation conceals that the wage laborer does some work for free. Now, readers should now be able to see that something of decisive importance occurs when labor power's value or price is transformed into the form of wages. That is, into the value or price of labor itself. On this form of appearance, which renders the true relation invisible, presenting it as the opposite of what it is, rest all the workers' and capitalist notions of what is fair and just, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all its illusions of freedom, and all the apologetic humbug in vulgar political economy. It may have taken world history a long time to reveal the secret of wages, yet nothing is easier to understand than the necessity, the raison d'etre, of this form of appearance. The exchange that takes place between capital and labor first presents itself to our perception as a normal purchase and sale in the commodity market. The buyer parts with a definite sum of money, while the seller disposes of an article that isn't money. A legal mind will recognize at most a material difference that is expressed by the legally equivalent formula. So there's a little Latin here, this do ut des, do ut facius, facio ut des, and facio ut facius, and it's a matrix that is explained in the footnote. Editor's footnote, lowercase I. Furthermore, since exchange value and use value are in and of for themselves incommensurable magnitudes, the formulation, the value of labor, the price of labor, seems no more irrational than the formulation, the value of cotton, the price of cotton. And the worker is paid only after he has supplied his labor in its function as a means of payment. Money realizes, but only retroactively, the value or price of the article supplied, which in this case is the value or price of the labor expended. Finally, the use value the worker provides isn't in fact his labor power. It's the function of that labor power. That is the function of that labor power, a particular form of useful labor, such as, to use our textile example, such as tailoring, shoemaking, spinning, and so on. The characteristic that makes such labor different from every other commodity, namely that it functions also as the universal value-creating element, goes undetected by everyday consciousness. Now, let's look at things from the worker's point of view. He receives the value produced during 6 hours of labor, say 3 shillings for his 12 hours of labor. For him, those 12 hours are the means of producing the 3 shillings. The value of his labor power could vary as the value of his usual means of subsistence does, rising from 3 shillings to 4 or falling from 3 shillings to 2. Its value could also remain constant while the changing ratio of supply and demand drives the price up to 4 shillings or down to 2 shillings. Darn those eggs. But the worker always supplies 12 hours of labor, and thus, whenever the amount of the equivalent he gets increases or decreases, it necessarily seems to him that the value or price of his 12 hours of labor has changed. On the other hand, this circumstance misled Adam Smith, who treated the workday as having a constant magnitude, into thinking just the opposite. That is, that the value of labor is constant, while the value of the worker's means of subsistence can vary, and the same workday can therefore be represented in different amounts of money, more or less, for the worker. Then there's the capitalist. He wants to get as much labor as he can for as little money as possible. In practice, then, all that interests him is the difference between labor power's price and how much value labor power creates when activated. But he tries to buy all commodities for the minimum amount of money and always explains his profit as the result of shrewd deals, buying commodities below their value and selling them for more than they're worth. Buy low, sell high, right? He never comes to see that if such a thing as the value of labor really existed and he really bought labor at its value, capital wouldn't exist. His money wouldn't even be transformed into capital. In addition, phenomena we see in the actual movement of wages seem to prove that the capitalist pays the value of labor power's function, or of labor itself, not that of labor power. These phenomena all belong to one of two large classes. First, changes in wages that occur when the length of the workday varies. Now, one might just well conclude that the capitalist pays the value not of a machine, but of what a machine does, since it costs more to rent a machine for a week than a day. Second, the second large class, individual differences between the wages of workers who carry out the same function. We find such variations in the system of slavery, big slaves and little slaves. But there, they don't give rise to the same illusions because the sale of labor power takes place undisguised. It's in the open. In the slave system, however, it is the slave owner who enjoys the benefits of above average labor power and suffers when it is below average. Whereas in the wage labor system, the worker himself is the one who gains and loses. For in the one case, the worker himself sells his labor power, when the other, his labor power, is sold by a third person. What holds for all forms of appearance and their hidden underpinnings holds also for the form of appearance. That is, the value and price of labor, or wages, but not for the essential relation that appears through that form, namely, the price and value of labor power. As accepted modes of thought, forms of appearance are reproduced spontaneously and without mediation, while their hidden underpinnings have to be discovered by science and scholarship. Classical political economy has come close to stumbling onto the true state of affairs, but it hasn't consciously formulated what's fact, and won't, as long as it remains in its bourgeois skin. That's the end of chapter 17, Karl Marx, volume 1. Here are the footnotes. Number 1, Mr. Ricardo ingeniously enough avoids a difficulty which on a first view threatens to encumber his doctrine. That value depends on the quantity of labor employed in production. If this principle is rigidly adhered to, it follows that the value of labor depends on the quantity of labor employed in producing it, which is evidently absurd. By dexterous turn, therefore, Mr. Ricardo makes the value of labor depend on the quantity of labor required to produce wages. Or, to give him the benefit of his own language, he maintains that the value of labor is to be estimated by the quantity of labor required to produce wages, by which he means that the quantity of labor required to produce the money or commodities given to the laborer. This is similar to saying that the value of cloth is estimated not by the quantity of labor bestowed on its production, but by the quantity of labor bestowed on the silver for which the cloth is exchanged. And yes, this isn't Smith or Ricardo, but Samuel Bailey. Number 2, footnote 2. If you call labor a commodity, it's not like a commodity which is first produced in order to exchange and then brought to market, where it must exchange with other commodities according to the respective quantities of each, which there may be in the market at the time. Labor is created at the moment it is brought to market. Nay, it is brought to market before it's created. Footnote 3, treating labor as a commodity and capital, the produce of labor as another, then is if the values of those two commodities were regulated by equal quantities of labor, a given amount would exchange for the quantity of capital which had been produced by the same amount of labor. Antecedent labor would exchange for the same quantity as present labor. But the value of labor in relation to other commodities is determined not by equal quantities of labor. And there's an editor's note. There was an editor's note above, an anonymous pamphlet published in London in 1821. Editor's note for number 3 is for the same amount as present labor is for the same amount of present labor in the source text. Footnote 4, it had to be agreed, yet another edition of the social contract, that whenever he exchanged work already done for work yet to be done, the latter, that is the capitalist, would receive a higher value than the former, the worker. This is from Sismondi. Editor's note in his parenthetical remark, Marx refers to On the Social Contract or Principles of Political Right, an influential 1762 book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Footnote 5, labor, the exclusive standard of value, the creator of all wealth, no commodity. Hodgkin. Footnote 6, on the other hand, treating such expressions as licentia poetica merely reveals how impotent the analysis is. This is why, in opposition to Proudhon's phrase, labor is said to have value not as a commodity in and of itself, but in regard to the values supposedly potentially to be contained within it. The value of labor is a figurative expression, unquote. I wrote, that is, Marx wrote, in labor as a commodity, which is a grim reality, he, Proudhon, sees nothing but a grammatical ellipse. Thus, the whole of existing society founded on labor as a commodity is henceforth founded on a poetic license, a figurative expression. If society wants to eliminate all the drawbacks that assail it, well, let it eliminate all the ill-sounding terms, change the language, and to this end, it is only to apply to the economy for a new edition of its dictionary. Right to work laws, remember. It, of course, even easier to say that value is nothing at all. This is an editor's note. One can then say, one can then put whatever one wants into that category. For example, J.B. Say says, what is value? Answer, what is a thing that, what it is what a thing is worth. What is price? The value of a thing expressed as money. And why does labor on the land have a value? Because we put a price on it. So value is what a thing is worth, and the land has value because its value is expressed as money. In any case, there's a very simple way of making sense of the why and wherefore of things. And the quote that includes the editors include the source of the quote from Say. Footnote 7, the critique of political economy, where I say that as I examine capital, I will solve the following problem. How does production on the basis of exchange value solely determined by labor time lead to the result that the exchange value of labor is less than the exchange value of its product? And they include the various translation notes. Footnote 8. The Morning Star, a London free trade newspaper that is naive to the point of being fatuous, insisted again and again during the American Civil War, displayed as such moral indignation as is humanly possible, that the Negroes in the Confederate States worked for free. You know, there's some people still say that, which is even scarier. What it should have done is compare the daily costs of one such Negro with those of a free worker in London's East End. Number 9, when Adam Smith, discusses peace wages, he refers to the variation of the working day only incidentally. Now, the editor's notes, and there's only one for chapter 17. And as I said before, it's a matrix. So, do ut est, do ut facias ut des, and facio ut facias is a Latin phrase expressing the 4 contractual relations according to Roman law. I give that you may give. I give that you may do. I do that you may give. I do that you may do. Do diddy diddy do. Doobie doobie do. But anyway, that's all I have to say on these matters. I won't read the chapter 19 notes, although there's no math, and he essentially repeats what is, I think, said better in the current translation. So that's my conclusion on that peculiar basis. And there is an argument outlined for the Harry Cleaver version that is also below. Note that this is the outline from the Harry Cleaver version for 18, the outline for the Harry Cleaver version of chapter 19. I've included two videos for 18 and 19 using the old translation, the prior translation. So that should finish off our little day. Let me look at see if there's any profundities in the chat. Lies. All labor appears as paid labor. Don't get me started on that. Indeed, surplus labor might mean something different in each specific situation. Indeed, labor costs. Yes, it is individuals and not labor as whole. The subjectivity is built into this. That is the whole business of whether women, particularly in cognitive capitalism, are equal to men. It's just the absurdity there is even worse. Particularly in certain fields, with all due respect. I mean, actually, and that's the kind of interesting problem that is presented in the sciences. See STEM. Anyway, okay, so that's the things I've went over time. I anticipate. Let me stop share and get us off the live stream so we can wait to see Star Trek: The Next Generation at the top of the hour.